Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the absolute nightmare that was being mortal in Greek mythology. The cosmic joke of existing in a world where gods treat your suffering like their personal entertainment channel and your happiness like a glitch that needs immediate fixing. So before we explore this beautiful disaster together, hit that like button if you enjoy having your historical assumptions gently destroyed, and subscribe if you want more deep dives into why the past was somehow even worse than you imagined. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our little community of history masochists spread across the globe, probably all questioning their life choices at 2 a.m. Now, get comfortable, grab a drink, maybe some ambrosia if you've got connections to Olympus, dim those lights, and let that background noise wash over you. Tonight, we're not just learning about ancient Greece, we're living it. We're waking up in that straw bed, smelling those plumbing aromas, and discovering exactly why being noticed by Zeus was basically a death sentence with extra steps. So you think you could handle being immortal in Greek mythology? That's precious. Really? Like thinking you could survive a family dinner where your relatives have the power to turn you into livestock and the temperament of particularly vindictive teenagers. You probably imagine yourself as the clever hero who outsmarts the gods, wins the beautiful princess, and gets songs written about your adventures. Sweet summer child, you're not the hero. You're not even the hero's best friend. You're the unnamed farmer in the background, whose crops get destroyed when Demeter has a mood swing about her daughter's custody arrangement. You're the fisherman whose boat gets capsized because Poseidon didn't like how some other sailor three kingdoms overlooked at a dolphin. You're the parent trying to raise children in a world where playground bullies include actual monsters and the school guidance counselor is an oracle who speaks exclusively in riddles that usually predict your doom. Tonight, we're going to experience exactly what that felt like day by agonizing day, in a world where the phrase divine intervention was less miracle and more "oh gods, what did I do wrong now?" So settle in, because we're about to discover why ancient Greeks invented philosophy. Someone had to try making sense of existence when the people running the universe had the emotional stability of caffeinated toddlers with unlimited power. Let's begin. You wake up before dawn because the rooster's crow is nature's alarm clock, and nature doesn't believe in snooze buttons. Your bed is a pile of straw that's seen better centuries, and your pillow is whatever rock felt softest when you collapsed last night. Welcome to mortal life in ancient Greece, where every day is a festival of suffering and the gods are the guests of honor at your misery banquet. Step outside your mud brick hovel and the first thing that hits you isn't the Mediterranean breeze. It's the smell. Human waste, animal waste, rotting fish, and whatever died in the agora last week all conspire to create an aromatic symphony that would make a skunk weep. Your neighbors are already up, not because they're early risers, but because someone's goat got loose and is currently eating their only tunic. Again, you're a farmer, because 90% of everyone is a farmer, and the other 10% are either priests who spend their days reading sheep entrails like morning newspapers, or aristocrats who think physical labor is what happens to other people. Your farm consists of 3 olive trees, a patch of barley that looks suspiciously like weeds, and a goat named Hermes who has trust issues and a tendency to headbutt anyone who gets too close to his personal space. But here's the thing about being immortal in Greek mythology. It's not just that life is hard. Life everywhere is hard. It's that the gods have made it their personal hobby to ensure your existence remains as complicated as possible. They're like cosmic middle schoolers with unlimited power and the emotional maturity of particularly vindictive house cats. Take Zeus, for example. The king of the gods, lord of the sky, master of thunder, and apparently professional home wrecker. You'd think running the universe would keep him busy, but no. He's got time to notice that your neighbor's wife has particularly nice ankles, and suddenly there's a mysterious golden shower of rain that smells suspiciously like divine testosterone. 9 months later, your neighbor is raising a demigod who shoots lightning bolts when he's teething. And that's if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, Zeus notices you directly. Maybe you made an offhand comment about how you could probably throw a better lightning bolt. Maybe you forgot to sacrifice a perfectly good goat on his feast day. Maybe you just looked at him wrong. Suddenly you're a tree. Not metaphorically. Literally. You are now an oak tree, and your biggest concern is hoping woodpeckers have better things to do. The other gods aren't any better. Poseidon controls the seas, which would be fine if he wasn't basically an aquatic toddler having permanent tantrums. You need to cross the water to trade your olive oil for grain. Well, too bad. Poseidon's having a mood, because some sailor somewhere didn't compliment his beard properly. Now there are waves the size of mountains, sea monsters with too many tentacles, and whirlpools that spin you around like divine laundry. Your boat, assuming you can afford a boat, is basically a wooden death trap held together with hope and whatever tar you could scrape together. The sail is made from whatever fabric your wife could spare, which means it's probably your only good tunic, and now you're sailing into a potential hurricane, wearing what amounts to a burlap sack that itches in places you didn't know could itch. And if you somehow survive Poseidon's maritime mood swings, you still have to deal with Hades. Now, Hades is actually one of the more reasonable gods, which tells you something about the bar they've set. He mostly stays in his realm, minds his own business, and only occasionally kidnaps young women to be his wife. But death is still his domain, and death in ancient Greece isn't the gentle drift into peaceful sleep you might hope for. No, death is a journey. A literally terrible journey where you have to pay a ferryman named Charon who has the customer service skills of a particularly surly DMV employee. You need exact change, a coin, specifically, placed on your tongue or over your eyes. If your family forgets this crucial detail, or if they're too poor to afford the fare, you get to wander the shores of the river Styx for eternity, watching other dead people get boat rides while you're stuck like a ghost at a bus stop with no schedule. But let's say your family remembers the coin. Congratulations! You now get to ride in Charon's boat, which is basically a floating coffin with a cranky captain who doesn't appreciate small talk. The journey across the river Styx isn't pleasant. The water is black. The air is cold, and there are sounds in the distance that suggest other passengers didn't make the crossing successfully. Once you reach the other side, you face judgment. 3 judges decide your fate based on how you lived your life. If you were good, you might get to spend eternity in the Elysian Fields, which is basically divine retirement community with better weather. If you were bad, you get eternal punishment that's usually ironic and always unpleasant. If you were average, which most people are, you go to the Asphodel Fields, where you wander around as a shade for the rest of forever, which is exactly as exciting as it sounds. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. You're still alive, which means you still have to deal with the entire Olympic pantheon and their commitment to making your existence as bewildering as possible. Athena is the goddess of wisdom and warfare, which is like combining a philosophy professor with a cage fighter. She's also the patron goddess of Athens, which means if you live anywhere else, she considers you inferior by default. You could be the wisest person in your village, but if you live in Sparta, Athena thinks you're basically a knuckle, dragging cave dweller who's lucky to have figured out fire. And speaking of Sparta, if you're unlucky enough to be born there, your childhood is basically military boot camp run by people who think child abuse builds character. At age 7, boys are taken from their families and thrown into the agoge, which is an educational system designed by someone who clearly never liked children. You learn to fight, steal food without getting caught, and endure pain without complaining. If you cry, you get beaten. If you don't cry, you probably get beaten anyway for not learning fast enough. The Spartan idea of childhood development includes sleeping outside in winter, eating just enough food to prevent death, and fighting other children for entertainment. By the time you're 20, you're either a perfectly trained killing machine or dead. There's not much middle ground. If you're a girl in Sparta, you get slightly better treatment, which means you're expected to be physically fit so you can produce more warriors. You get to exercise, compete in athletics, and have opinions, which is more freedom than women get in most other Greek cities. Of course, your ultimate purpose is still to marry a warrior and produce the next generation of people who think violence solves everything. Athens, by contrast, considers itself civilized. They invented democracy, which means instead of one king making all the terrible decisions, you get a bunch of citizens making terrible decisions together. Of course, citizenship is limited to free, born males over 18, so if you're a woman, a slave, or a foreigner, you get to watch democracy happen to you without any input whatsoever. Athenian education focuses on philosophy, rhetoric, and arts, which sounds lovely until you realize that philosophy mainly consists of old men arguing about whether reality is real. Rhetoric is the art of talking people into doing what you want, and the arts are mostly about depicting gods doing inappropriate things to mortals. Your typical day in Athens starts with a trip to the Agora, which is part marketplace, part social club, and part gossip central. You go there to buy food, sell whatever you've managed to produce, and hear the latest news about which god has been seen where doing what to whom. The Agora is where you learn that Zeus has been spotted as a swan again, which means some poor woman is about to have a very confusing afternoon. The merchants in the Agora are professional hagglers who consider honest pricing a sign of weakness. You want to buy a jar of olive oil. The merchant starts by asking for your firstborn child, 3 goats, and your wife's jewelry. You counter with a reasonable price. He acts personally insulted and launches into a speech about how his family has been pressing olives since before the Trojan War, and how dare you insult his ancestors with such a lowball offer. This continues for an hour. Eventually, you agree on a price that's probably fair, but by then you've missed lunch and developed a headache from listening to him explain why his olives are personally blessed by Athena herself. And speaking of the Trojan War, that's another thing about being mortal in Greek mythology. Wars happen, and they happen because gods get bored, or offended, or decide they need some entertainment. The Trojan War started because 3 goddesses couldn't agree on who was the most beautiful, so they let a Trojan prince be the judge. He picked Aphrodite because she promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, who happened to be already married to a Greek king. This seemed like a good idea to exactly no one except the prince, but by then it was too late. 10 years of war followed, thousands of people died, and entire cities were destroyed, all because divine beauty pageant went wrong. If you're a soldier in this war, your job is to stand in a line with a bunch of other nervous men, hold a shield that weighs more than your wife, and wait for someone to tell you to start stabbing people you've never met. The heroes get all the glory, but you're not a hero. You're just a guy with a spear who hopes he lives long enough to see his family again. The heroes, meanwhile, are busy having personal dramas that would make soap opera writers weep with envy. Achilles spends most of the war sulking in his tent because his commanding officer took his favorite captive woman. Agamemnon sacrifices his own daughter to get favorable winds for sailing. Odysseus comes up with the idea of hiding inside a giant wooden horse, which works only because the Trojans apparently never learned about looking gift horses in the mouth. And after the war ends, assuming you survive, you still have to get home. This should be simple. You get on a boat and sail home. But this is Greek mythology, so nothing is simple. The gods are still paying attention, and they have opinions about everything. Odysseus, the hero famous for his clever ideas, takes 10 years to make a journey that should have taken a few weeks. He encounters Cyclops, who eat his men, sirens who try to lure him to his death, a witch who turns his crew into pigs, and sea monsters with multiple heads and too many teeth. By the time he gets home, everyone assumes he's dead. His wife is being harassed by suitors who are eating all his food, and his son has grown up without ever meeting him. That's if you're a hero. If you're just a regular soldier, you probably die in the first year of fighting, and your family never finds out what happened to you. Your wife remarries after waiting a reasonable amount of time. Your children call someone else father, and your name is forgotten except maybe in a list of casualties that no one reads. But let's assume you survive whatever war you're drafted into and make it home. You still have to deal with daily life in a world where gods interfere with everything. You want to plant crops. You need to make sure you don't offend Demeter, goddess of the harvest. You want to get married. You better hope Hera approves of your choice. And Hera has strong opinions about everything related to marriage and family. Getting married in ancient Greece is less about love and more about economics and politics. If you're a man, You negotiate with your potential bride's father about the dowry, which is basically the price tag on his daughter. If you're a woman, you don't get much say in the matter. Your father picks your husband based on who can offer the best deal, and your job is to produce male heirs and manage the household. The wedding ceremony involves sacrifices to various gods, because apparently even your personal happiness requires divine approval. You sacrifice sheep to Hera for a successful marriage, wine to Dionysus for fertility, and whatever else the priests tell you is necessary. By the time you're done sacrificing things, you've spent more on the wedding than you'll earn in the next year. If you're lucky, your spouse is someone you can tolerate. If you're unlucky, you're stuck with someone you can't stand for the rest of your life, because divorce is complicated, expensive, and socially scandalous. If you're a woman, you have almost no legal rights. You can't own property, you can't vote, and you can't appear in court without a male relative speaking for you. Your daily routine as a married woman involves managing the household, which means supervising the slaves if you can afford slaves, or doing all the work yourself if you can't. You weave cloth, prepare food, raise children, and try to stay out of trouble. If you're spotted talking to men who aren't your relatives, people assume you're up to something inappropriate. If you're too friendly with the neighbors, people gossip. If you're not friendly enough, people gossip about that too. Having children should be a blessing, but in ancient Greece, it's also a gamble. Infant mortality is high, childhood diseases are common, and medical care consists mostly of praying to the right gods and hoping for the best. If your child gets sick, you take them to a shrine of Asclepius, god of medicine, and leave offerings while hoping divine intervention works better than whatever herbs the local healer has available. If your child survives to adulthood, you then have to worry about their future. Sons need to learn a trade or inherit the family business. Daughters need to marry well. Both require connections, money, and luck, none of which are guaranteed. And throughout all of this, the gods are watching. Always watching. They see everything, have opinions about everything, and intervene whenever they feel like it. You could be the most pious, hardworking, honest person in your city, and still end up cursed because you accidentally offended some minor deity you've never heard of. Take Arachne, for example. She was a weaver, probably the best weaver in her region. She was proud of her skill, which was understandable because she'd spent years perfecting her craft. But she made the mistake of claiming she was better at weaving than Athena. This was probably true, but Athena didn't appreciate the comparison, so she challenged Arachne to a contest. Arachne wove a tapestry depicting the gods behaving badly. Zeus's affairs, Poseidon's rapes, the various ways the Olympians had abused their power. It was beautiful work and completely accurate, which was exactly the problem. Athena couldn't deny the skill or the truth of the images, so she destroyed the tapestry and turned Arachne into a spider. The moral of the story is supposed to be about the dangers of pride, but the real lesson is that even when you're right, especially when you're right, the gods will punish you for making them look bad. Or consider Niobe, who made the mistake of being happy about her children. She had 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, all healthy and accomplished. She was proud of them, as any mother would be. But she made the error of comparing her fertility to Leto, who had only 2 children, Apollo and Artemis. Leto took offense and complained to her children, who decided that mass murder was an appropriate response to a mother's bragging. Apollo and Artemis killed all 14 of Niobe's children with arrows. Niobe wept so much she turned to stone, but even as a rock, she continued crying. The lesson here is apparently that being happy about your family is dangerous if you're too vocal about it. The gods prefer mortals to be miserable and quiet about their misery. Even trying to be a good parent can backfire spectacularly. Tantalus wanted to honor the gods by inviting them to dinner, but he decided to test their omniscience by serving them his own son, Pelops, as the main course. Most of the gods immediately recognized what they were being served and refused to eat, but Demeter, distracted by grief over her missing daughter, accidentally ate part of Pelops's shoulder. The gods were horrified and brought Pelops back to life, giving him an ivory shoulder to replace the missing part. As for Tantalus, they condemned him to eternal punishment in the underworld, forever hungry and thirsty, but unable to reach the food and water that surrounded him. The disturbing part isn't just that Tantalus killed his own son, it's that he thought this was an appropriate way to honor the gods. What kind of relationship do you have with your deities when child sacrifice seems like a reasonable dinner party idea? And that's another thing about mortal life in Greek mythology. The religious requirements are both essential and completely unpredictable. You have to honor the gods, but the gods have different personalities, different preferences, and different tolerance levels for human error. Zeus likes grand gestures and expensive sacrifices, but he's also easily distracted by attractive mortals. Hera values marriage and family, but she's violently jealous and takes out her anger on her husband's victims rather than her husband. Poseidon controls safe travel over water, but he holds grudges for decades and has a temper that can sink entire fleets. Apollo appreciates music and poetry, but he's also the god of plague and can kill you with disease if you annoy him. Artemis protects hunters and wild animals, which seems contradictory until you realize she's really the goddess of hunting rules, and breaking her rules results in being torn apart by your own hunting dogs. Aphrodite is supposed to be about love and beauty, but her version of love often involves obsession, betrayal, and people dying for passion. Ares is the god of war, which you'd think would make him popular with soldiers, but even other gods find him annoying, because he's basically violence without strategy. Demeter controls the harvest, so you absolutely must keep her happy, but she's prone to depression that affects the entire world's food supply. When Hades kidnapped her daughter Persephone, Demeter stopped doing her job and let everything die until Zeus worked out a custody arrangement. The custody arrangement, by the way, is that Persephone spends half the year with her mother and half the year with a husband in the underworld. This is why we have seasons. Winter happens because Demeter is sad that her daughter is away. Spring returns when Persephone comes back. Your entire agricultural year depends on a family drama between gods. Hephaestus is the god of blacksmiths and craftsmen, which should make him useful and practical. But he's bitter about being ugly and lame, and he sometimes takes out his frustrations on mortals who remind him of his inadequacies. If you're a metalworker who gets too skilled or too proud of your work, Hephaestus might decide you need to be taken down a peg. Hermes is the messenger god, but he's also the god of thieves, merchants, and liars, which tells you something about how the Greeks viewed commerce and communication. He's clever and usually helpful, but he's also unpredictable and enjoys pranks that might ruin your life. And then there's Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and religious ecstasy. His festivals involve drinking, dancing, and losing control in ways that seem fun until you wake up the next morning and discover you've done things you can't remember and can't undo. Dionysus represents the idea that sometimes you need to let go of rationality and social conventions. But letting go in ancient Greece can mean anything from a mild hangover to accidentally killing your own family members in a religious frenzy. Every god requires different offerings, different rituals, different forms of respect. You have to remember which gods to honor for which activities, and you have to do it correctly because improper worship is worse than no worship at all. If you sacrifice a goat to Artemis, who prefers deer, she might take it as an insult. If you offer wine to a god who prefers milk, you've wasted resources and offended a deity. And the rituals themselves are complicated and expensive. A proper sacrifice involves specific animals, specific prayers, specific ceremonies conducted by priests who expect to be paid for their services. The animal has to be perfect, without blemishes or defects, which means you're sacrificing valuable livestock that you probably can't afford to lose. After the sacrifice, parts of the animal are burned for the gods, parts are given to the priests, and parts are shared among the worshippers. This sounds like a community feast, but it's also the only time most people eat meat. So religious festivals are simultaneously spiritual experiences and rare opportunities for protein. If you can't afford to sacrifice large animals, you can offer smaller things: bread, wine, oil, incense. But the gods notice the difference. A wealthy man's sacrifice of a bull carries more weight than a poor man's offering of grain. Divine favor, like everything else, is easier to buy when you have money. And then there are the mystery cults, secret religious societies that promise special knowledge and better treatment in the afterlife. the Eleusinian mysteries, for example, centered around Demeter and Persephone, and involved secret initiation ceremonies that participants swore never to reveal. The penalty for revealing the secrets was death. These mystery cults appealed to people who wanted more than the standard religious offerings, but joining them required time, money, and social connections. The initiation ceremonies could take years to complete and involve traveling to specific locations, undergoing purification rituals, and learning secret knowledge that might or might not actually improve your prospects in the afterlife. The Orphic mysteries focused on the journey of the soul after death and provided detailed instructions for navigating the underworld. Initiates learned special passwords and procedures for dealing with the various obstacles they'd encounter as spirits. This sounds helpful, but it also meant spending your living years memorizing complex religious instructions instead of focusing on immediate practical concerns. And even if you successfully navigate all the religious requirements, maintain good relationships with all the relevant gods, and live a life that meets divine standards, you're still mortal. You're still going to age, get sick, and die. The gods are immortal and eternally youthful, but they're also eternal adolescents with unlimited power and limited wisdom. They fall in love, get jealous, hold grudges, and change their minds without warning. Zeus swears an oath he later regrets, but can't break because divine oaths are binding even for gods. Hera spends centuries plotting revenge against people who wronged her decades ago. Apollo and Poseidon hold a grudge against Troy for years because a Trojan king once cheated them out of payment for building the city's walls. The gods' personal dramas become your problems. When Zeus and Hera fight, storms rage across the Mediterranean. When Poseidon and Athena compete for patronage of Athens, earthquakes shake the region. When Apollo and Artemis defend their mother's honor, entire cities pay the price. And the gods don't just interfere in major events. They meddle in personal relationships, family disputes, and individual life choices. You want to marry someone your parents don't approve of. A god might take sides. You're having trouble with your business. Maybe you've inadvertently offended a deity. Your children are disobedient. Perhaps a god is testing your parenting skills. Every success might be divine favor that you need to acknowledge with proper gratitude and offerings. Every failure might be divine punishment that you need to atone for with more offerings and public demonstrations of humility. You spend a significant portion of your time and resources trying to figure out what the gods want from you, and whether you're meeting their expectations. The oracles don't make this any easier. These are priests and priestesses who claim to speak for the gods and offer prophecies about the future. The most famous is the oracle at Delphi, who speaks for Apollo and gives advice to everyone from common farmers to kings and generals. But divine prophecies are notoriously ambiguous. The oracle might tell you that a great victory awaits if you cross a certain river, but she won't specify whether you'll be the victor or the victim. She might warn you about a danger coming from the east, but east is a big direction and danger is a broad category. King Croesus famously consulted the oracle before going to war with Persia. She told him that if he crossed the river Halys, a great empire would be destroyed. He assumed this meant he would destroy the Persian Empire, so he invaded. The great empire that was destroyed was his own. The oracle's prophecies are always technically correct, but they're correct in ways that usually don't help the people who ask for them. It's like having a fortune teller who knows the future but enjoys watching people misinterpret her advice. And even when you understand what the gods want, doing it might be impossible or require choices no reasonable person should have to make. Agamemnon had to choose between sacrificing his daughter and abandoning the war against Troy. Oedipus tried to avoid the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother, but his attempts to prevent it were exactly what made it happen. The gods seem to enjoy putting mortals in situations where every choice leads to tragedy. It's like they're conducting experiments to see how humans respond to impossible moral dilemmas. And they're always surprised when mortals fail to find perfect solutions to unsolvable problems. Your daily life is a constant balance between trying to please gods who have contradictory demands, competing with neighbors for limited resources, and raising a family in a world where childhood mortality is high and adult life expectancy is low. You work from dawn to dusk, Save every bit of surplus for emergencies that will inevitably come, and hope that your children survive long enough to take care of you when you're too old to work. If you live in a city, you're crowded together with thousands of other people in buildings that are fire hazards and sanitation nightmares. If you live in the country, you're isolated and vulnerable to bandits, wild animals, and natural disasters. Either way, you're dependent on weather, crops, trade routes, and political decisions made by people who don't care about your welfare. Medical care consists mostly of prayer, herb remedies that might or might not work, and surgical procedures performed without anesthesia by people who learn their skills through trial and error on previous patients. If you get seriously injured or sick, your options are to get better on your own, die, or become a permanent invalid dependent on your family's charity. Dental care is virtually non-existent. By the time you're 30, you probably have missing teeth, chronic pain, and infections that affect your ability to eat. Your diet consists mainly of bread, olive oil, wine, and whatever vegetables you can grow or afford to buy. Meat is rare, dairy products spoil quickly, and preserved foods are heavily salted or dried to the point where they're barely edible. Your clothes are made from wool or linen that you or your family members have woven by hand. You probably own 2 or 3 tunics, 1 cloak, and 1 pair of sandals that you repair repeatedly until they fall apart. In winter, you layer clothing and huddle near fires that fill your house with smoke. In summer, you sweat in heavy fabrics because light, breathable clothing is expensive and impractical for working outdoors. Your house, if you're lucky enough to own one, is small, dark, and poorly ventilated. Windows are openings in walls that you cover with shutters or cloth when the weather is bad. Your furniture consists of a few stools, a table, some storage chests, and sleeping pallets that you roll up during the day. Privacy is a luxury you can't afford. Everyone in your family sleeps in the same room, and everyone in your neighborhood knows everyone else's business. Entertainment consists mainly of religious festivals, which combine worship with celebration, but also remind you constantly of your dependence on divine favor. The festivals include processions, sacrifices, competitions, and performances that are impressive when you consider the resources available. But there are also expensive community events that require months of preparation and contributions from everyone. The theatre performances are supposed to be educational and inspiring, but they're mostly about tragic heroes making terrible choices that lead to death and destruction. The comedies are crude and focus on bodily functions, sexual situations, and political satire that might get you in trouble if you laugh too loudly at the wrong jokes. Athletic competitions celebrate physical excellence, but they also remind you that most people are not physically excellent. The athletes are usually wealthy men who can afford to spend years training instead of working, and the prizes go to people who are already successful and well connected. If you're a woman, your entertainment options are even more limited. You're not supposed to attend most public festivals, compete in athletic events, or participate in political discussions. Your social life revolves around other women in your family and neighborhood, and your conversations are supposed to focus on domestic matters rather than broader community issues. You give birth at home with the help of female relatives and maybe a midwife if you can afford one. Childbirth is dangerous, painful, and often fatal. If you survive, you might have many pregnancies, but not many living children. You're expected to keep trying until you produce male heirs, regardless of the toll on your health. Your sons will eventually inherit property and take care of the family's interests. Your daughters will marry into other families and become their responsibility. You invest time and energy in raising children who will leave you, while depending on children who might not survive to adulthood. And through all of this, the gods are watching and judging. They have opinions about how you raise your children, treat your spouse, conduct your business, and worship at their shrines. They reward behavior they approve of and punish behavior they don't. But their standards are inconsistent and their punishments are often disproportionate to the offenses. You might spend years living a careful, pious life, only to be destroyed because you happened to be in the wrong place when a god was having a bad day. Or you might benefit from divine favor that you did nothing to earn, simply because a god noticed you and decided to help. The randomness is perhaps the most maddening aspect of mortal life in Greek mythology. You can't earn safety through good behavior, because the gods don't always reward virtue. You can't protect yourself through careful planning, because divine intervention can disrupt any plan. You can't even predict which gods will be interested in your particular situation, because they have wide, ranging and overlapping areas of influence. Your best strategy is to honor all the gods as much as you can afford, avoid attracting divine attention through excessive pride or success, and hope that if the gods do notice you, they're in a good mood. It's like trying to live in a neighborhood full of powerful, unpredictable neighbors who might help you or destroy you depending on their whims and your luck. The heroes in the stories get to have grand adventures, tragic romances, and memorable deaths that people sing about for generations. But heroes are exceptional by definition. Most mortals don't get to be heroes. Most mortals are background characters in other people's stories, and those stories usually don't end well. You're not Achilles, destined for glory and early death. You're not Odysseus, clever enough to outwit gods and monsters. You're not Helen, beautiful enough to launch 1,000 ships. You're just a person trying to grow enough food to feed your family, earn enough money to pay your debts, and live long enough to see your children established in adult life. Your story doesn't get told because your story isn't unique or dramatic. You wake up, work, eat, sleep, and repeat the cycle day after day until you die of disease, accident, or old age. If you're lucky, your children remember you fondly and tell their children about their grandfather or grandmother who worked hard and loved them. If you're unlucky, you're forgotten within a generation. But even being forgotten might be preferable to being remembered in Greek mythology, because being memorable usually means you did something that attracted divine attention. And divine attention is almost always bad news for mortals. The few mortals who get happy endings in Greek myths usually earn them through extraordinary suffering, incredible luck, or direct divine intervention that's so rare it becomes the subject of stories precisely because it's so unusual. For every mortal who gets rescued by a god, there are thousands who get crushed by divine indifference or malice. And the gods don't learn from their mistakes or develop better judgment over time. They're immortal, which means they have eternity to repeat the same patterns of behavior that cause problems for mortals. Zeus will always be distracted by attractive women. Hera will always take out her jealousy on the wrong people. Poseidon will always have anger management issues. You can't outlive their bad habits, negotiate with their better nature, or appeal to their sense of fairness, because immortal beings don't have the same incentives for personal growth that mortals do. They don't face consequences for their actions, they don't have to worry about their reputations in the long term, and they don't have to live with the results of their decisions. This is your existence as a mortal in Greek mythology. You're trapped in a world controlled by beings who have unlimited power, limited wisdom, and no accountability for their actions. You have to worship them, obey them, and hope they don't notice you, while also hoping they notice you enough to help when you need help. You live in constant awareness that everything you build can be destroyed, everyone you love can be taken away, and all your plans can be disrupted by forces beyond your control or understanding. Your life is precarious, your future is uncertain, and your death is inevitable. And the worst part is that this uncertainty never ends. Even after you die, you still have to deal with divine judgment, underworld bureaucracy, and the possibility that some god might decide to resurrect you for their own purposes or transform you into something else entirely. Death, which should be the end of your suffering, is just another phase of existence under divine control. The underworld has its own rules, its own hierarchies, and its own opportunities for divine beings to interfere with your fate. So you wake up each morning knowing that today might be the day a god notices you, a hero's quest destroys your city, a natural disaster ruins your crops, or a war breaks out because divine beings are having personal problems. You work, you pray, you make offerings, and you hope that tomorrow will be similar to today, because in Greek mythology, change is usually bad news for mortals. But let's get more specific about what your actual days look like, because the abstract horror of divine caprice is just the background noise of your existence. The real grind is in the details. The endless small miseries that add up to a life that would make modern people weep with gratitude for antibiotics and indoor plumbing. You wake up not just tired, but genuinely exhausted, because sleep in ancient Greece is less restorative rest and more unconscious endurance test. Your straw mattress is home to fleas, bedbugs, and whatever small creatures have decided that living in your bedroom is preferable to living outdoors. The straw is old, compressed, and smells like the animals it came from, which died months ago and weren't particularly clean when they were alive. Your blanket is wool, if you're lucky enough to have wool, and it's scratchy, heavy, and smells like wet sheep even when it's dry. If you're not lucky enough to have wool, your blanket is whatever cloth you could piece together, and it provides about as much warmth as optimistic thinking. The temperature in your house depends entirely on the season and your ability to keep a fire going. In winter, you're cold. Not chilly, not uncomfortable, but genuinely cold in a way that makes your bones ache and your joints stiff. The fire is your best friend and your most demanding master. You spend half your waking hours collecting fuel, tending the flames, and trying to balance heat with the very real risk of burning down your entire mud, brick existence. The fire also fills your house with smoke, because proper ventilation is a luxury that hasn't been invented yet for people in your social class. Your eyes water constantly, your throat is perpetually scratchy, and everything you own smells like a barbecue that went wrong. In summer, you face the opposite problem. Your house becomes an oven that traps heat, and cooking smells in a way that would violate several modern building codes. Your morning routine starts with checking whether anything died overnight. This includes your livestock, your family members, and occasionally your neighbors, because sudden death is so common that you've developed casual protocols for dealing with it. If everyone is breathing, congratulations. You've won the daily lottery of not waking up to tragedy. You step outside to relieve yourself, because indoor plumbing is a concept that won't exist for several more centuries. Your bathroom is wherever you can find a bit of privacy, which usually means behind your house or near a designated area that the entire community uses for the same purpose. The smell is indescribable, and the hygiene is non-existent, and the privacy is theoretical at best. Water for washing comes from whatever source is nearest, which might be a well, a stream, or a cistern that collects rainwater. The water is not clean by any modern standard. It's full of sediment, organic matter, and microscopic life forms that would horrify anyone with knowledge of germ theory. But you don't have knowledge of germ theory, so you drink it, cook with it, and wash with it while hoping for the best. Your breakfast, if you're fortunate enough to have breakfast, consists of bread that's barely recognizable as bread. It's made from whatever grain you could afford, ground with stones that leave grit in the flour, and baked in ovens that you don't control. The result is dense, coarse, and sometimes moldy, but it's calories, and calories are what keep you alive. If you have olive oil, you dip your bread in it. If you have cheese, you eat small pieces to make it last longer. If you have neither, you eat the bread plain, and tell yourself it tastes better than starving, which is true but not particularly comforting. After breakfast, you begin the work that will consume the rest of your day. If you're a farmer, which you probably are, this means walking to fields that may or may not produce enough food to keep you alive for another year. Your farming tools are simple, heavy, and inefficient. Your plough is wood, maybe reinforced with iron if you're prosperous, and it requires enormous physical effort to use. You work alongside animals that are as tired, hungry, and irritable as you are. Oxen are strong but slow and stubborn. Donkeys are clever, but have opinions about everything and express those opinions through biting and kicking. Your relationship with your livestock is based on mutual dependence and mutual resentment. The work is backbreaking in the most literal sense. You bend, lift, carry, and dig for hours at a time. Your hands develop calluses, then blisters on top of the calluses, then scars where the blisters used to be. Your backache is constantly. Your shoulders burn, and your legs tremble with fatigue by midday. And all of this effort might be wasted if the weather doesn't cooperate, if the gods are displeased, if raiders attack your region, if a plague kills your crops, or if any of dozens of other factors beyond your control decide to ruin your year. You plant seeds in hope and harvest in anxiety, never sure whether you'll have enough food to survive the next season. If you're not a farmer, you might be a craftsman, which sounds more prestigious but comes with its own collection of miseries. Blacksmiths work in conditions that are hot, dangerous, and filled with toxic fumes. Potters spend their days covered in clay dust that gets into their lungs and never comes out. Weavers develop repetitive stress injuries that modern medicine could treat, but ancient medicine ignores. Merchants travel constantly, which means dealing with bandits, corrupt officials, dishonest trading partners, and the general hazards of moving valuable goods through territories controlled by people who might decide that robbery is easier than negotiation. You sleep in unfamiliar places, eat unfamiliar food, and trust strangers with your livelihood because you have no other choice. If you're a woman, your work is centered around the household, but don't mistake this for easier labor. You spin thread, weave cloth, prepare food, clean house, care for children, tend the sick, and manage the complex social relationships that keep your family integrated into the community. You do all of this while pregnant, nursing, or recovering from childbirth for most of your adult life. Your cooking is done over an open fire with tools that would be considered primitive camping equipment by modern standards. You grind grain by hand, preserve food by methods that sometimes work and sometimes result in food poisoning, and stretch ingredients to feed more people than the ingredients were designed to feed. Childcare in ancient Greece is simultaneously the most important and most undervalued work in society. Children die frequently from diseases that modern medicine prevents with simple vaccinations. They're injured in accidents that could be prevented with basic safety equipment. They're malnourished despite your best efforts to feed them adequately. You love your children desperately, but you also can't afford to become too attached to them, because the statistical likelihood of losing them is too high to bear. This creates a psychological balancing act that no parent should have to manage. Caring enough to provide the best possible life while maintaining enough emotional distance to survive their potential death. Education for your children consists mainly of learning whatever skills they'll need to survive as adults. Boys learn farming, crafts, or military skills depending on their family's circumstances. Girls learn household management, textile production, and the social skills necessary for marriage and motherhood. Formal education is available only to wealthy families, and even then it focuses more on physical training and social connections than on intellectual development. If your children show unusual talent or intelligence, this might be a blessing or a curse. Talented children might attract favorable attention from powerful people, but they might also attract the wrong kind of attention from gods who don't appreciate mortals getting above their station. The social pressure to conform is enormous. Your community watches everything you do, judges every decision you make, and gossips about every deviation from accepted behavior. If you're too successful, people assume you're cheating or have made deals with malevolent spirits. If you're too unsuccessful, people assume you've offended the gods and might bring bad luck to the entire community. Religious obligations consume a significant portion of your time and resources. Every major decision requires consulting the gods through sacrifices, prayers, or visits to local shrines. Every success requires thank offerings. Every failure requires atonement. Every season requires appropriate festivals and ceremonies. The religious calendar is complex and demanding. Different gods have different feast days, different requirements, and different consequences for neglect. You have to remember which gods to honor when, what offerings they prefer, and what prayers are appropriate for which circumstances. Mistakes in religious protocol can result in divine punishment that affects not just you but your entire family and community. Local priests serve as intermediaries between you and the gods, but they're also human beings with their own agendas, prejudices, and limitations. They might be genuinely holy men who provide valuable spiritual guidance, or they might be con artists who use religious authority to extract money from desperate people. Often, there's something in between well-meaning individuals who honestly believe they're helping, but whose advice is based on superstition rather than divine insight. The economic system is based on subsistence agriculture supplemented by whatever trade or craft work you can manage. Money exists but isn't always available or useful. Much of your economic activity involves bartering goods and services with neighbors, which requires maintaining complex social relationships and keeping track of who owes what to whom. Debt is a constant threat. If your crops fail, if your livestock dies, if you get sick and can't work, you might need to borrow money or goods to survive. Interest rates are high, repayment terms are harsh, and defaulting on debt can result in losing your land, your freedom, or your family members who can be sold into slavery to satisfy your creditors. Slavery is a normal part of society, and the line between free and enslaved is sometimes thinner than you'd like to think. Free people can be enslaved as punishment for crimes, as payment for debts, or simply because they were captured during raids or wars. Slaves can sometimes earn or buy their freedom, but they can also be killed or sold at their owner's whim. Even if you're free, your freedom is limited by your economic circumstances, your social status, and your gender. You can't travel freely without permission from authorities. You can't change occupations easily, because each trade has its own requirements and social connections. You can't speak openly about political matters if your opinions differ from those of people in power. The legal system is basic and often corrupt. Justice depends more on your social status and personal connections than on the facts of your case. If you're accused of a crime, you might be judged by people who have personal interests in the outcome. If you're the victim of a crime, you might have no recourse if the perpetrator is more powerful or better connected than you are. Violence is common and often goes unpunished. Domestic violence is considered a private family matter. Violence against slaves is considered property management. Violence between free men is sometimes acceptable depending on the circumstances and the social status of the people involved. Women and children have few legal protections. They're considered property of their male relatives and have limited rights to make decisions about their own lives. A woman can be divorced by her husband for almost any reason, but she can't divorce her husband except in extreme circumstances. Children can be abandoned, sold, or killed by their fathers with minimal legal consequences. Travel is dangerous and uncomfortable. Roads are poorly maintained, often impassable during bad weather, and frequented by bandits who view travelers as mobile treasure chests. Inns are rare, expensive, and often unsafe. Most travelers sleep outdoors and carry their own food and water. If you need to travel by sea, you're dependent on weather conditions, the skill of the captain, and the favor of Poseidon. Ships are small, overcrowded, and prone to sinking. Sea voyages that should take days can take weeks if the winds are unfavorable. Pirates are common, and naval protection is minimal. Communication over long distances is slow and unreliable. Messages are carried by travelers who might be delayed, robbed, or killed before reaching their destinations. You might not know about important events in distant places for weeks or months after they happen. Family members who move away might disappear from your life completely, leaving you wondering whether they're alive or dead. Medical knowledge is limited and often counterproductive. Doctors believe that illness is caused by imbalances in bodily humors, divine punishment, or evil spirits. Treatment involves bloodletting, purging, prayer, and herbal remedies that sometimes help but often make things worse. Surgery is performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or knowledge of anatomy. If you need an operation, you're held down while someone cuts into you with tools that aren't sterile. Many patients die from shock, blood loss, or infection. Those who survive often have permanent disabilities. Childbirth is handled by midwives who work with traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Some of this knowledge is helpful, but much of it is based on superstition. Maternal mortality is high, infant mortality is higher, and complications during birth often result in the death of both mother and child. Mental illness is attributed to divine punishment, demonic possession, or moral weakness. Treatment involves religious rituals, physical restraint, or exile from the community. People with mental health problems are often abandoned by their families and left to survive on their own. Dental problems are common and painful. Tooth decay, gum disease, and dental abscesses cause chronic pain that affects your ability to eat, sleep, and work. Tooth extraction is the only treatment available, and it's performed without pain relief by people whose qualifications consist mainly of willingness to do the job. Your diet is monotonous and often inadequate. Bread, Olive oil, wine, and vegetables form the basis of most meals. Meat is rare and expensive. Fish is available if you live near water, but preservation methods are limited, so it must be eaten quickly or it spoils. Nutritional deficiencies are common. Vitamin deficiencies cause scurvy, rickets, and other diseases that affect your physical and mental development. Iron deficiency causes anemia that leaves you constantly tired and weak. Lack of dairy products results in calcium deficiency that affects bone development and dental health. Food preservation is a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, meat and dairy products spoil quickly. Vegetables can be dried or pickled, but the process is labor-intensive and doesn't always work. Grain can be stored if you can protect it from rodents, insects, and moisture, but crop failures mean you might not have enough grain to store. Clothing is expensive and time-consuming to produce. Every piece of fabric is made by hand, from growing the fibers to spinning thread to weaving cloth to sewing garments. You own very few pieces of clothing, and you wear them until they fall apart. Washing clothes is difficult and harsh on the fabric, so you don't wash them often. Your shoes, if you have shoes, are sandals made from leather that you repair repeatedly. In winter, you wrap your feet in cloth or fur, but your feet are often cold and wet. Foot problems are common and can make walking painful. Personal hygiene is limited by the availability of water, soap, and privacy. You wash when you can, but you're often dirty. Body odor is normal and accepted because everyone smells. Lice, fleas, and other parasites are common and difficult to eliminate. Your house is small, cramped, and shared with multiple generations of your family. Privacy is non-existent. Personal possessions are minimal. Storage space is limited, so you can't accumulate many belongings even if you can afford them. Lighting comes from oil lamps that produce dim, flickering light and fill the air with smoke. Candles are expensive. Most activities stop when darkness falls because you can't see well enough to work safely. Heating comes from firewood, which you must collect, cut, and store. In winter, you're often cold despite your best efforts to stay warm. In summer, cooking fires make your house uncomfortably hot. Entertainment is rare and simple. Storytelling, music, and dancing provide occasional relief from the daily grind, but most of your time is consumed by work and survival. Religious festivals offer community celebration, but they also require contributions that strain your budget. Books are rare and expensive. Most people can't read, and even those who can have limited access to written material. Knowledge is transmitted orally, which means information can be lost or distorted over time. Your social life revolves around your extended family and immediate neighbors. You know everyone in your community, and everyone knows you. Relationships are complicated by economic dependence, family obligations, and social hierarchies that determine how you interact with different people. Marriage is arranged by families based on economic and social considerations. Love is secondary to practical concerns like dowries, family alliances, and the need to produce children who will support you in old age. Divorce is difficult and socially stigmatized, so you're likely to remain married even if you're unhappy. Parenting involves preparing your children to survive in a harsh world while trying to protect them from dangers you can't control. You want your children to be successful, but you also know that too much success can attract unwanted attention from gods or powerful humans. Aging is difficult and often painful. Without modern medicine, chronic conditions like arthritis, heart disease, and diabetes are debilitating and untreatable. You remain useful to your family only as long as you can work, and you depend on your children's charity when you become too old or sick to contribute. Death is a constant presence in your life. People die young from diseases, accidents, and violence. Funeral rites are important for ensuring proper treatment in the afterlife, but they're also expensive and time-consuming. Grief is a luxury you can't afford for long because survival requires constant attention to practical matters. This is why it sucked to be mortal in Greek mythology. Not just because life was hard, life has always been hard, but because life was hard in a world controlled by beings who treated mortal suffering as entertainment, mortal achievement as a threat, and mortal happiness as a temporary condition that needed correction. You lived knowing that the gods were always watching, always judging, and always ready to remind you that no matter how clever, strong, or virtuous you might be, you are still just a mortal in a world designed for the amusement of immortals. And that knowledge coloured every moment of every day for the rest of your unfortunately brief and perpetually anxious life.